Welcome back, guys. Jimmy Jules here again with another CREY prop tutorial. In today's episode, we'll be going over the Look At Rotator prop. We can use this prop to make our objects look at specific things in our scene. We'll of course be going through some examples of this, but first of all, we'll go through the settings menu. Our first setting here is for the speed. This is measured in degrees per second, so if we have this set to 360, it'll be able to make a full rotation of the object in 1 second. We'll see these settings in action in the example shortly. The next option down is the acceleration. By default this is disabled, but if we enable it, it gives us an input and an output for our wires, and an acceleration value. This value is how quickly the Look At Rotator will accelerate, so this Look At Rotator will accelerate by 45 degrees per second every second. So for example, over the first second, the Look At Rotator would start rotating and then increase to 45 degrees per second. Then on the next second, it would increase a further 45 degrees per second and reach 90. It will keep on increasing until it reaches its maximum speed that we've set. So for example, if we set this to 360, which is our maximum speed, it will accelerate to its maximum speed over a second. This is exactly the same for the deceleration, except this will affect its slowdown as opposed to its speed up. I'll go through the target types in this drop-down menu in the examples. We're able to target props, players, and tags. We also have the disable X and Y options. This will restrict the Look At Rotator's rotation to a specific axis. So for example, if we enable disable Y, this will prevent the Look At Rotator from being able to rotate on the Y axis. The same goes for the disable X option, but for the X axis. Then of course, down the bottom we have the power button for the prop, which enables or disables the functionality for the prop entirely. Now that we've been through the settings, I'll take you through a couple of examples. First of all, we'll be making a character, a non-playable character, that follows you around. You can see the NPC turns to look at our character, moves forward, and then stops when it gets in range. These are the 4 props that we're going to be using to make our following NPC. The first thing we'll want to take note of is which way our character is facing. We'll place the Look At Rotator on top of our NPC, and we'll want to make sure that the top of the Look At Rotator is facing the same direction as our character. The top of the Look At Rotator is the side with the arrow on it. This will mean that the Look At Rotator will make our character face the correct direction when it rotates. Just to show you a quick example of what will happen if we don't do this, you can see I've angled the Look At Rotator to the right, and you can see that the right side of my pug is always facing me, rather than the pug facing forwards. So all we need to do to fix that is just make sure the top of the Look At Rotator is facing the same direction as our character. Now this Look At Rotator isn't going to do anything just by putting it on the back of our dog. We need to actually attach it somehow. So we're going to hit the G shortcut from our pug for the glue, and we're going to glue the pug or our character to the Look At Rotator. As soon as we've done that, the Look At Rotator will take effect on the object, and it will rotate. You can see this already working on the dog here. Now we want to incorporate the follow around. We'll use a sensor here, and we'll place this just above the Look At Rotator, so in the center of our character. We'll also be using an if not gate and a directional mover. We'll grab up the settings pages for our sensor, not gate, and directional mover. Now by default, we want our character to be moving towards us. Our NOT gate will provide a signal if there is nothing going into it, so we'll plug this directly into the directional mover's power. Just like to mention that we now have 3D wiring working as well. Thank you very much to the development team for this is so cool. And we can see the wires even when the settings menus are closed, so you can see I don't have the settings menu for the directional mover open at the moment, but you can clearly see the wire going into it. Then when we open up the settings page, it'll tell us exactly where it's plugged in, which is really handy. We'll be using this sensor to detect our player and then to stop the NPC from moving. So because we want our NPC to be moving when the player is not in this area, we'll plug our sensor into our NOT gate, so when the player is not in the area, then we'll be moving. We also need to glue our mover to the pug. We'll then select our NOT gate, Look At Rotator, and sensor, all by holding the control key. We'll then press the B shortcut to box these objects, and then we'll select the box. We'll want to make sure the directional mover is not contained in this box, because we need the directional mover to target the box, so we'll press the T shortcut while we're hovering over the mover, and then target the box. Now you can see we have our NPC character that turns to follow you and then stops when it gets in range. I've got a couple of examples here for the disable X and the disable Y options on the lookout rotator as well. I have these two cones here and they're sort of acting like arrows. So the pointy end is the way that the lookout rotator is facing. You can see the disable X arrow is not facing me because it's restricted to only turning on the Y plane, which is of course the up and down plane. So if we jump, you can see the red cone rotates to look at my Y rotation, but not my X rotation. The disable Y option is exactly the same, but for the Y axis. So this cone will not look at my Y rotation, it will only look at my X rotation. In the settings, we also have the look at tag option in the drop-down menu. We could use this option in multiplayer to make a lookout rotator look at a specific team. You can think of the cop tag and the thief tag as team 1 and team 2 respectively. At the moment, my player is on the thief team, so this lookout rotator is going to look at my character. But if I change my character to be on the cop team, you can see my player is now marked with the cop tag, and this lookout rotator is going to look at me instead. I can of course change myself back to a thief, and then only the thief lookout rotator will look at me. You can change which team your players are on the player manager under the second tab. The next example we'll go through is an enemy cannon that turns to rotate towards you and shoots cannonballs. You can see here I've just made a quick little cannon out of primitive shapes, and then I've glued this group of primitive objects to the lookout rotator. We then have a sensor which is detecting our player, and when our player is detected, you can see this is plugged into our timer. You can see with our lovely 3D wires here that our timer finish pulse is then headed back into our reset timer. So we've got a timer that resets itself every second and produces a pulse. This pulse is then going towards our spawner. So if we open up our spawner here, you can see that our timer is producing a pulse every second and is telling our spawner to spawn an object. Our spawner is targeting our box down here, and all this box contains is a directional mover and a little sphere to act as the cannonball. I've changed some of the properties of the sphere here, but most importantly I've caused it to do damage, and this will happen when it impacts the character. We've got our directional mover targeting our ball, so that when our box is spawned by our spawner, it's going to send the red cannonball in the direction that the cannon is facing. You can see we're not in the sensor area just yet, so our cannon is not firing, but as soon as we step into the sensor area, it's going to start triggering our timer, and that's going to start firing our cannon. And that's pretty much all there is to that cannon. That's a pretty simple one, but it's pretty cool. The final thing that we'll be going over is an NPC that you can go up to and it'll give you instructions. So you can see we've got our little dingo over here, and if we go over to it, you can see we've got some instructions up the top that say space to continue, and it says hey there, and we press space and it gives us the next line, and it says I have a quest for you. If you collect 3 coins, I'll give you a prize. Good luck. And we press space one final time, and it disables the camera view and resets the system, so if we go back up to the NPC again, we'll get a repeat. This setup is going to rely heavily on some functionality from our selector, and we'll be using 6 ports for this setup. We'll also grab out a NOT gate, and we're going to want to plug in our port number 1 into this NOT gate, into the if port. So what we're basically saying here is if the selector is not on the first port. Just for our character detection setup, we've got a sensor here above the NPC, and we've just got this set to a cylinder, and we're going to use this sensor's detected output to switch our selector to port 2. So when our character steps into this area to interact with our NPC, our selector will be set to port 2. When this happens, we want our lookout rotator to turn on because our character has entered the area and we want our NPC to look at them. I've disabled the Y-axis for this lookout rotator because we don't want it to be looking on the Y-axis. We also have some text saying over here just to indicate there's something to interact with over here, and we'll turn that off when the selector is on port 2 as well, so we'll power this with port 1. So when our player steps into this zone, this over here text will disappear because our selector will switch to port 2. I've also got a camera set up here, and I've just got this in a nice angle that I've set. You can hit the test camera button and then move the camera around to the position that you'd like it, and then just hit the X button and we'll exit camera mode. We'll want this to be active the entire time that our player is interacting with the NPC. This means that we want this to be active on ports 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, but rather than wiring these individually into the camera through an OR gate, we can also say if the selector is not on port 1, then activate the camera, because that will mean if it's not on port 1, it'll be on one of these other outputs. So we'll plug the signal from our NOT gate into the camera's power. So this is saying when our selector is not on port 1, then activate the camera. We also want some instructions to appear so the player knows which button they need to press to continue with the dialogue. So I've got a text displayer here that says space to continue, and we're also going to power that with the NOT gate. So we'll plug our NOT gate output into the power of the text displayer. So now we've got our selector on port 2, we want to give the player some instructions. So first of all, we'll start out with an introduction. Hey there. We'll grab our port 2 output and we'll plug that into the power. And we're going to put the rest of our dialogue on the remaining ports of the selector. So we'll open up our next bit of dialogue, which is I have a quest for you. We'll plug port 3 of our selector into the power of this, grab the next bit of dialogue, port 4, and for the final bit of dialogue we'll use port 5. We're also going to use port 6 here, but this will be our reset port. So we're going to plug port 6 back into port 1 on the same selector. So when our selector hits port 6, it's going to bounce back to port 1 again and reset the process. Now we just need a way to step through these selector outputs. In this circumstance, we're using space to continue, so I'll grab out an input trigger, and space is the jump key. So I've just got this set to jump, and I'm also locking the player, and this will prevent the player's character from jumping when they press space while they're speaking to the NPC. We want this spacebar to continue to the next port on our selector, so we're going to plug this key pressed into our next port. We only want this to be turned on when the player has started interacting with our NPC though, so we'll grab out our NOT gate and we'll plug that into our input trigger's power. So now our input trigger is only going to be powered when our selector is not on port 1. So let's give this a quick test. So you can see the dog says over here, and then when we reach the dog, that over here text disappears, and the dog turns to face us and gives us some instructions. We can spacebar through these instructions, and then when we reach the end, it'll disable our camera again and give us control back of our character. You might have noticed though, that we can still move our character while we're interacting with the NPC. It would be nice if we could stop that. A very simple way to do this is with 4 input triggers, one for each direction. So we've got one for forwards, backwards, left, and right. We've also got these set to all lock player, which means the player will not be able to use these keys when this input trigger is enabled. So we don't want our player to be able to move when they started to interact with the NPC, so we'll again grab our NOT gate, our trusty NOT gate, and we'll plug the output from our NOT gate into each of these input triggers. So now, when our selector is not on its first port, it's going to enable all of these input triggers, and it's going to lock the input from the player. So let's give this a test. You can see we approach the dog, and then I can no longer move, until I spacebar through the instructions, and my controls come back again, until of course I decide to go back and revisit the dog. And that's all there is to that NPC. Anyway guys, that's all the examples I've got for the look at rotator for us. If you have any questions at all, of course, just leave a comment. Hope you all enjoyed the video. This has been Jimmy Jules, and I'll see you on the next one.